Some people call it the Big White Combine or the Sky Shredder. Others refer to it as the nasty four-letter word that starts with an H. No matter what you call it, hail is never ideal, especially on crops in the midst of the growing season. Earlier this week, a storm moved through the state that left area crops beaten and dismantled. Being early in the growing season, your first thought might be to want to replant as soon as possible. But UNO Cropping Systems Specialist Justin McMechan says the most important thing to do is to wait. We caught up with him on Wednesday morning to learn more about what producers need to do following a hail event.
When it occurs, and so everybody wants to get out and make a decision, especially an early June hail date implies a potential for replant. But the biggest thing is wait 7 to 10 days. I always tell growers the best thing you do is take a couple photos and go to the lake. So that's the first thing is give it some time. Those plants need to regrow before we know what's going on.
7 to 10 days. I think there's going to be producers wanting to pull their hair out when they hear that.
Correct.
Why is that? Why do we need to wait 7 to 10 days?
Yeah, and you know, we can go a little bit earlier, but we have some nice time-lapse videos to show why you really want to wait 7 to 10. And in part, it's because we have a plant that's got a pretty significant amount of injury on it, whether it's corn or soybeans. And what we're really interested in at this point in the season is a viable growing point on that plant. And depending on the stage of development, mostly for corn, that growing point can be in a couple different places right now. For growers, we're hoping it's still below ground, although a lot of our early planted corn, it's going to be above ground. And so splitting stalks after 7 or so days gives us a pretty good idea if those are viable and going to be growing or not. Soybeans is a little bit easier, but it's still important to wait on soybeans just because we can have some stem damage below that.
You mentioned the fact that it is early June here, and we saw this latest hail event. Some producers saw it earlier than this, but with this one we saw on Tuesday in particular. Talk about the timing of that and maybe some opportunities and challenges that brings on.
Yeah, and the opportunities is that our crops are fairly early in their development, both corn and soybeans. That has some advantage in terms of what the yield impacts would be if we don't see stand loss. For corn, we're in that critical transition period between what is V5, the number of collars that are on that plant, and V6 when that growing point comes above ground. So below ground growing points, if growers know they're prior to that, they're probably in pretty good shape. We still have to wait. And then for soybeans, if they're just popping out of the ground, they're pretty soft and fleshy tissue. It's easy to knock off growing points on those. So a little bit of growth on soybeans is good. Most of our early planted soybeans are about V2, V3 right now. And we looked at some fields this morning. They're doing okay, but it's hard to tell. 7 to 10 days.
So what have you learned? I mean, you've done a lot of research when it comes to hail. What have you learned about corn versus soybeans and their response to hail? Big picture.
Yeah, big picture. Okay, so soybeans has a lot of growing points on it, and so big picture on it is you got to remove that, or you got to have a viable growing point. So anything, as long as you have one little node above the soil surface, it's that cotyledonary node. So there's 2 little bits of fleshy tissue around that are small leaves. Those, as long as they're intact, you're in good shape with soybeans. You can remove all the vegetation above that. In fact, when those plants start to regrow, we'll get 2 stems coming off of those. So we can actually double our node count per day to an undamaged plant. Corn's a lot different. It's got that one growing point right in the center of that stem or stalk, depending on where that plant is in development. That needs to be viable for us to have a healthy plant in there. But right now, it's really anything prior to V7 in corn. It's all about live plant stand. So even though those plants can be tattered and the leaves can be shredded off, as far as we know, and research that we've done in our own lab shows there's not a lot of yield loss associated with that. It's mostly live plants.
Mm-hmm. So again, the big headline is wait at least 7 days, even up to 10 days before making a decision here. Who are some of the people you need to be in contact with, though, during that 7 to 10 days?
Yeah, if you've got a crop adjuster and you've got hail insurance, that's the first person you really want to be speaking with. They're going to tell you the same thing. We need to wait that 7 to 10 days. If you've got consultants that are checking fields, that's also the people you want to notify. And then, of course, extension. We are a source of a lot of information. We can come out and take a look at a lot of these fields. And so getting those resources in hand and communicating with those people, getting those photos in place too, and having some, it can be an important part of the insurance part of this too.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the research. I've seen firsthand some of the research that you've done with an ice machine to replicate hail.
Yeah.
Talk about that and what you've been able to learn over the past 5 years that we might not have known beforehand.
Yeah. So that simulated hail machine is actually a recently built one based on an older version that was back in the 1980s. It shoots ice at 170 miles an hour. It would replicate the hail event we saw yesterday pretty well. It's told us a lot. It's taken some of the shock out of these hailstorms for those that have seen its damage and the time-lapse camera footage that's available. There are some eerily similar photos to what we can do with that hail machine and then what that can look like 7 to 10 days later. And so if a grower is really kind of in panic mode, go and watch one of those videos. You can just see how much these crops can regrow in the next 7 to 10 days. We've done research too in terms of interaction with diseases and other things like that. That doesn't apply too much to our early season hail events, maybe with the exception of Goss's wilt in corn, but the growers who know that they had a history of that. And that interaction really needs to happen as the hail event's occurring, because those plants heal up pretty quick and they're not as susceptible to that. So there's a lot to learn in terms of hail damage. We're trying to get some objective evaluations in terms of using UAVs, and those things take time because it's such a different evaluation technique to what we're doing now, which is adjusters looking at plants in the field.
And of course, our viewers today can learn more at the Hail No website that Nebraska Extension has put together. I want to give you the final word, though, 30 seconds or so. What else do you want to add on this topic?
You know, that's the primary resource to go to. There are so many videos on there that growers can sit through and watch each crop and its response over time, and in terms of what to do during those periods. And so I really recommend people get onto the website, go through and look at the various crops they might be dealing with. There's great information there.